Everyone. I'll give a little bit of a summary to kind of settle us in the present topic. And so first, this whole discussion of the paramitas, the six perfections, is kind of centered in what we call the practice of the bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is someone who has generated the mind of bodhicitta, which means the mind of awakening, the mind of enlightenment. And that is an intention. It's an intention. It's also a set of practices that align with that intention. So there's bodhicitta in aspiration and bodhicitta in action, or engaged bodhicitta and aspirational bodhicitta. So this engaged bodhicitta is the intention to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. And so the very beginning of the teaching, normally you'll hear our teachers encourage people to generate that intention. And I would do the same for you now. That even if you're here just kind of out of curiosity, or if you're here thinking maybe you can gain something for yourself, the attitude of bodhicitta is one that encompasses, this wish to free all beings from suffering, bring them all to enlightenment. You are included in that all beings. It's not like you're wishing for other people and not yourself. So Khenpo Rinpoche always says, if you can wish something great for everyone, why would you only wish it for yourself? So I would encourage everyone to start with that intention, the intention of, that you're going to listen to these teachings, maybe take something home from these teachings with the aspiration that that could be something meaningful in your spiritual development, that could be meaningful in liberating all beings from suffering and bringing them to the state of enlightenment. So with that, we'll kind of come back around where we left off last time. So we were talking about this general idea of bodhicitta. We have this aspirational intention of bodhicitta. And then we have these six practices, which are how we engage in that. How do we work with this intention? If we have an intention to free beings from suffering, to bring them to enlightenment, how do we start making steps on that path? And so first, the six perfections are aligned or arranged in an order of easiest to most difficult to kind of master or to develop. And so we start with generosity. And in generosity, it's not merely giving something, but it's, as with all of the perfections, there are kind of some qualities that make them a perfection. And one of those qualities is that that practice has to serve as an antidote to its opposite. And what that means in the case of generosity is that your act of generosity should be acting as an agent of kind of suppressing or reducing or eliminating your greed and covetousness. And for example, with discipline, which is the second of the six perfections, by practicing discipline, that should be kind of suppressing or subduing or eliminating your harmful or destructive behavior, the behavior that is causing more obstacles in your life or more obstacles in your spiritual development. And now third, moving into patience, the opposite or the counter factor to patience is anger. And so the practice of patience in this tradition, in this context, is considered the practice for, generally speaking, overcoming anger. But there's more to it than that, as we will discover as we go into the main topic. And so in this whole kind of world of the practice of the bodhisattva, or the practice of someone who has this intention of the mind of enlightenment, of bodhicitta, then the whole discussion of the practice of patience isn't merely for a discussion of, oh yeah, it would be better not to be angry, but from the context of in the development of a person who's seeking enlightenment on this path of the bodhisattva with the intention of bodhicitta, you see that anger is one of the worst, like most counterproductive and destructive forces that could completely obstruct your capacity to actually develop in the direction of this intention of bodhicitta. And so that's where this discussion is centered in. Of course, for our day-to-day lives, anger is destructive, it's harmful, it hurts us and it hurts others, it ruins our relationships. Of course, even in a worldly sense, patience is great. We should, I say should, it would be really healthy and helpful to ourselves and our relationships and everyone around us if we develop it. But the specific discussion of patience in terms of the perfection of patience, or in terms of this discussion of the paramitas, is coming from the perspective of what is going to aid the development of a person on the path of the Bodhisattva, what is going to help them to ripen and nurture other beings on their path of spiritual development, what is going to lead to this person and other people's expansion of their compassion and wisdom and understanding and so forth. And so it is kind of within that context that you find the discussion of the paramitas, or these perfections. So of course, generosity is great for anyone, regardless of whether you care about enlightenment or even believe in the idea of enlightenment or not. Having some sense of like personal discipline, like I'm not going to harm others, I'm going to be honest with others, I'm not going to cheat on my partner, all those kind of things. Those are obviously, healthy secular ethics, you could even say. Like I would say Buddhist ethics are secular ethics, by the way, because they're not commandments from the Buddha. All of the so-called ethics of Buddhism are things that the Buddha said, if you do this, this kind of thing is going to happen, and that's going to create an obstacle to your path of spiritual development. So if you don't want that obstacle or those problematic situations to come about, you shouldn't do those actions that would create that type of situation. So he didn't say, don't kill. He didn't say, don't steal. He said, if you steal, this is going to happen. So think for yourself, but you probably don't want to do that, So they're more like ways of training than they are rules of conduct. So I would say that, in my perspective, maybe you're divorcing it from secularism if you're talking about enlightenment or whatever, these kind of things. Maybe these are religious or spiritual ideas. But I would say it's not a system of ethics or something like that based on the commands of a deity or something like that. There's no sense of like, if you don't do it, you're going to hell because you're breaking the command of a god or something like that. There is a sense, however, in Buddhism that you will experience possibly incredible amounts of suffering such that it could be described as a hell type of perspective or a hell type of situation. If you kill and steal and lie and cheat and do all of these things, that there's going to be, a very negative experience that will come as a result of that. But it's because that's just the reality of the effects of those types of actions, and not because you're being punished for breaking the command of a deity or something like that. So anyway, that was a side point. That was a tangent. I apologize for that. But just coming back around. So we were, you first practice generosity, which is the easiest one to practice because, maybe on a greater level, it's hard, but like anyone can give $1 to someone or can help their friend carry some things or can even like share some food with someone or whatever. You can start very simply. In the text, it even says for people who are, there's a story of one king in the time of the Buddha who was so stingy that he couldn't help the people of his kingdom at all. And he was so stingy that like the Buddha first taught him, I want you to just imagine you're giving something to someone else, but actually just take the thing and hand it from your left hand to your right. And just practice giving and just imagining that you're giving to someone else. And then from there, he gradually trained to be able to actually give something to someone. And ultimately, the story goes that his kingdom became very prosperous because he developed a sense of generosity. So anyway, anyone can practice generosity from like very simple level up to, higher and higher levels. Second, discipline's much harder. It's much harder to, kind of make a commitment to refraining from certain actions or engaging in certain kind of positive actions, and especially refraining from negative actions that we might have deep, habits of, than it is just to give someone $1 or to help someone with a project or whatever, any kind of generosity. Third, moving into the perfection of patience, it's even harder to not get upset, which is kind of the essence of patience. I'll define patience here in a minute and get more into its kind of characteristics, but it's even harder to not get upset with someone than it is to maintain some kind of sense of personal discipline. And so this is the kind of the process. And then the next of the perfections after this one, which we'll talk about next month, is the perfection of diligence. And so that's even harder. The next is meditative concentration, which is even harder. And the last is wisdom, which is considered the hardest. And so all of the previous ones are considered methods for developing the subsequent ones. So you could say that each one is serving kind of as a cause for helping to develop the next one. So they're all kind of supporting each other as you move up into the more and more difficult practices. Ultimately, wisdom is the most difficult. And there are quotes like from Shantideva in The Way of the Bodhisattva, which is a famous text that everyone in the Tibetan tradition studies for learning about bodhicitta and the perfections and the trainings in bodhicitta and all this kind of stuff, where he says that all of the first 5 perfections were all taught as methods for developing wisdom. So that's just some more framing for like this whole context of the discussion of the perfections. So now we'll start talking about patience itself. And the kind of most simple definition of patience, but we're going to get into some sub-classifications of patience. There's some different ways of developing patience and so forth, but it just means to be undisturbed. And so when we talk about this, the first general topic that comes up in the traditional text is to think about the drawbacks or the faults of not being patient, and then the qualities or the advantages of being patient, before we even get into all the different subclasses of patience and all that kind of stuff. Because first, you want to kind of find out like, well, if I'm not patient, what's going to happen? Why not? Or why should I care, basically? And then once you care, then you can start to go deeper into like how you practice and so forth. So that's how the text is kind of established. The text first wants to make you care, and they make you care by showing you what's wrong with not being patient, what's good about being patient. Then it catches your attention, then you can go deeper. So we'll start with that. And so this is a little bit maybe of it sounds a little abstract at first, but I'll try and explain it a little bit. And so one of the most famous kind of quotes that is given in a lot of Buddhist texts is they say that patience will destroy all of the virtues that you've done. So there's like more detailed quotes. The one famous quote that people quote is, whatever excellent deeds, generosity, making offerings to the Buddhas and so forth, one may have gathered over 1,000 eons may be destroyed with one burst of anger. So just give a little context for maybe something a little bit more practical, because I know that sounds pretty abstract, talking about thousands of eons of past lives, of accumulated good deeds and all this kind of stuff. Maybe you don't even believe in that past life stuff. That's fine. Let me try and like center this in a little bit more something practical. Let's say when we talk about merit or meritorious deeds, the results of those deeds, what are they creating? So let's first talk a little bit about meritorious deeds. Like in the discussions of Buddhist karma, we talk about the 10 virtues, 10 non-virtues, that kind of thing. So the 10 virtues are the 4 virtues of speech, the 3 virtues of body, the 3 virtues of mind, and the opposites. So we've got 4 non-virtues of speech, 3 non-virtues of mind, 3 non-virtues of body. Basically what that means is like, if you are practicing the virtues, like let's say being honest, you're going to be gathering some, we would say it's your merit. You've done these virtues. It's your merit that because you've been honest, now people trust you. So you have some support network. There's these people that you've built trust with. If you speak pleasantly, they like you. You're not being harsh to them. You're being kind. You're being gentle. You're being sharing, caring, whatever. If you speak harmoniously in a way that brings people together, that's going to build more community. It's going to build better relationships, all that kind of thing. If you speak meaningfully and purposefully, then that is going to make people care about what you say. And so those are the 4 virtues of speech are speaking honestly, speaking pleasantly, speaking in a way that fosters harmony, and speaking meaningfully. The opposites of those are lying, speaking harshly or using harsh words, divisive speech, and meaningless chatter or kind of pointless speech. And so let's say you have been practicing these 4 virtues of speech and you've developed a lot of trust and community and harmony and everything. And then you get really ticked off and you scream at everyone and you outburst and you punch your friend. You destroyed every bond of trust you've ever built with them. Maybe if you've got a really great friendship, they'll forgive you, but who knows? So that's just showing, the point of this is that anger can really destroy all of the positive fruits of your virtuous actions that you've built in the past. So that's just kind of in my own, that's not from the text. That's from my own kind of attempt to explain that in a more practical manner. So, and so then they give some more. I'll just read a little bit from this text. There's some other kind of points that they make here. And so they say that in the grips of anger's affliction, this is more quotes from The Way of the Bodhisattva of Shantideva. In the grips of anger's affliction, the mind cannot experience peace. It cannot find joy or well-being, and thus a person cannot sleep and becomes unstable. So in the text and in the commentaries to this, it says, when you're angry, even if you are in a good situation, let's say you've got a great house, good food, meaningful relationships. When you're angry, you don't experience any of that as pleasant. Everything seems like terrible to you. This food is awful. I'm not interested in this. I don't want to talk to you, even though you're this beautiful, kind person that loves me. So that's, this is just going through some of the faults of anger, some of the reasons why you would want to try and overcome your anger, basically. And so then it says here that anger dwelling within someone lacking forbearance, lacking patience, will also show on the outside as a violent demeanor. Through this, friends, relatives, employees, and so forth all become fed up with the angry person. Even gifts and so forth cannot persuade them to put up with his or her presence any longer. So if you're always showing that anger, if you're always holding that anger, and even if you think you're holding it back, people will notice, and it affects the other people. It affects the people around you negatively. They won't want to be around you. So it's just more of the faults that are listing here. And so then it says also that if you have anger, that even the practices of the other perfections aren't going to bear any fruits. So the anger is going to cause such an obstacle to your practice that the other practices of the perfections won't be able to kind of develop you beyond a certain point. It's still going to be like kind of holding you down. And so basically it's obstructing your path of spiritual development, in addition to your worldly relationships and your worldly connections and relationships and support networks and all that kind of stuff. So then we talk about the qualities, or the good side of having patience. And so yeah, it's more or less just the same. It said that like whoever has patience is going to be happy in this life and in future lives. Whoever has patience and doesn't have anger is going to look attractive and going to bring people to them. Like people are going to want to befriend you if you are a person who doesn't have anger and who can foster good relationships and so forth. And so then those are kind of the first points, just to cover, to try and generate enthusiasm about this practice of patience. So thinking of the faults and then thinking of the benefits. And so basically you can just think of the benefits as the opposites of the faults. Like if we said that in the grips of anger's afflictions, the mind cannot experience peace, it cannot find joy or well-being, and thus a person cannot sleep and become unstable. Well, then the opposite is true. A person who's not in the grips of anger can experience peace. They'll find joy and well-being. They'll sleep well. They'll become stable. All those things are the kind of positive qualities of a person who has patience, a person who has patience and forbearance. And so, sorry, I'm taking a second because I'm looking at myself on the screen and I want to look at all of you on the thing, and I'm not figuring out how to do it. It's like making me on spotlight on my screen, and I want to look at you guys and not look at a picture of myself. It's kind of funny, like talking to myself on the screen. How do I do it?
Justin, if you go up to view and then you click on gallery.
I think I'm doing that. View. Oh, there we go. Boom. Got it. All right. Now I can see you all. That's much better. That was really awkward. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about the nature of patience. Like, what exactly is patience? I told you before, it's like not being disturbed, or it's a state of being undisturbed, but we'll get a little bit more into detail about that. So there are, generally speaking, in the text, three kinds of patience, or three ways of practicing patience. And so the first is being patient when confronted with harmful beings, like someone who's doing something harmful to you or people who you care about or something like that, or causes that you care about. It doesn't have to be to people. The second is something that they call patience as a voluntary acceptance of negative circumstances or suffering or whatever. Just kind of like saying, whatever, I'll just take it. It doesn't matter, that kind of thing. We'll get into what that means and some more examples of that later. And the third is forbearance as confidence born from contemplating the Dharma. And so I'll explain what that means later, but it has more to do with an understanding of the ultimate nature of phenomena, and that leading to a better capacity with being patient. The first two are more talking about, I would say, kind of ways of, it's not a way of suppressing anger. It's not a way of trying to subdue anger. It's a way of looking at the situation from such a different perspective that you just don't get angry anymore. So trying to recontextualize your entire experience of a situation that would provoke anger. So that's kind of what the first two are. And the third one is trying to, we'll get to it, but it's more about understanding from certain Dharma principles of like impermanence and emptiness and so forth, selflessness, interdependence, that from that perspective of this kind of ultimate nature, understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, that there is nothing to be angry about. So anyway, that sounds really vague right now, but we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. So first, just remember that there are three categories. The first is patience with people or beings who do something that's harmful, like to you or to people you care about. The second is patience as a voluntary taking on or voluntary kind of like acceptance of suffering. And the third is patience in terms of like having a certainty, having contemplated the Dharma. So let's get into this. So, and just so you know, in case you're interested, I think Rachel was going to maybe send this out, but I'm mostly talking from a text that is another text on these kind of Bodhisattva principle that's very commonly taught in the monasteries in India, especially in the Kagyu tradition, but also in the Nyingma tradition. And it's called The Ornament of Precious Liberation by Gampopa. The old translations of this were called The Precious Ornament of Liberation, but that was a mistranslation. It should be The Ornament of Precious Liberation, not Precious Ornament of Liberation. This is the new one with the better translation. So one of my teachers back in India, Taisitu Rinpoche, he was the head lama of the monastery that I was a monk at. He speaks really good English, and this is a crucial text in our tradition. And he would very often, I think I heard him, I don't even know how many times, every time he would mention the English name of this text, he would say, but they translate it wrong. It's Ornament of Precious Liberation, not Precious Ornament of Liberation. It was really hilarious. So now there's a new edition with his insistent translation of the title. So, okay. So now, when we're talking about patience with someone or beings or situations which are harmful to yourself or others, then that can take some different forms, like someone physically like attacking you, someone insulting you, someone saying something bad about you or someone you care about, or someone obstructing you or blocking you from getting something that you want. Those are kind of the ways that it's talked about. And so forbearance or patience means being unperturbed, not wanting to get back at them, and also not holding it in your mind, like not holding a grudge. So first, it means not being disturbed by the situation. Second, it means not wanting to get back at them. And third, it means not holding on to the grudge, not holding that in your mind. And so when they talk about how you do this, and so that you could say that those 3 points are kind of what it means to be patient. If you're patient, you're not going to be disturbed by the harmful situation. You're not going to want to get back at them or answer it. And you're also not going to hold a grudge about whatever it was. And so they give a bunch of different ways of actually doing this. And some of these are going to make perfect sense. Some of these are going to sound pretty far out. And so I might skip a couple of the far out ones, or maybe we can just share them and we can talk about them a little bit. We'll see. So I'll just read off the names of them, but don't worry about writing them down or anything. We'll just talk about them. So the first is the fact that the other person, the person who you think is harming, is not actually in control. The second is the fault due that it's actually your own karma ripening that this situation is happening. The third is the fault of your own physical existence. That one's kind of far out, and we'll talk about it. It's far out. The fourth is a fault in your own mind. The fifth is that there's no difference in fault, which we'll get to. It kind of means like, if they are getting angry at you out of ignorance, you're also getting angry back at them out of ignorance. So who's actually more at fault? I don't know. Anyway, we'll get to it. And then the sixth is the practical utility. And the seventh is the enormous kindness. That one's a little bit hard to understand too, but it makes sense when we get to it. 7 or 8, that the Buddhas will be delighted. And 9, the tremendous benefits of patience. So don't worry about writing those down. We're just going to talk about them. So the first, which is the fact that the others don't actually have control. So there's a common example where they say, if someone hit you with a sword, it's actually the sword that hit you, but it was driven by the person. So should you be mad at the sword or the person? Probably the person, right? But similarly, when that person hit you with the sword, it was their anger driving them and not them. So should you be mad at them or their anger? And so it's kind of like detaching this sense of like, this one gets tricky, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way, because I feel like this and the one about karma can bring about a sense that no one's to blame for anything, and then there's no justice, and then, you know, no accountability. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about your relationship in your mind, your emotional reaction to the situation, and how you can deal with that. That doesn't mean that just because you recognize that someone is driven by their negative emotions and therefore, in a sense, they're blameless or out of control, so you shouldn't be mad at them. This is a way for you to overcome your anger, not as a way of like saying that they shouldn't be held accountable. So like, for example, let's say that you're in a situation where someone did do something really harmful and you get really angry, and then you try to deal with that situation in a moment of anger. You're not going to deal with it in a wholesome or positive way that's going to create any kind of good outcome. But let's say instead, you are able to, through these 9 different techniques, or maybe just this first technique of recognizing that they're not to blame, they're driven by their negative emotions and their ignorance and so forth. Let's say you're able to take that on, and therefore you don't get angry. Just because you're not angry doesn't mean that you can't recognize the harm, recognize that the action was harmful. And then in that place, because you're not upset, you're in a really good, calm, stable, clear-minded position to actually do something about it, if there is something that needs to be done. So I think that sometimes people take these kind of teachings and they think, oh, well, I can't accept this because then that would mean that there is no justice in the world. There is no way of holding anyone accountable. You're just giving everyone a pass, but that's definitely not the case. This is about your reaction, your emotional reaction, and how you can get to a place where you're not disturbed by the situation. And when you're not disturbed by the situation, you're in a better place to actually help reconcile or help whatever needs to happen after that. So that's the first point. And I think that this is like one of those things where we actually experience this this recognition of the faultlessness in all kinds of other parts of our lives, but it's hard to apply more universally. Like in this situation, we're emotionally charged, so we don't want to say that they're not to blame. Like in a lot of times in the world, we can see situations where in certain parts of the world, in impoverished parts of the world, there's a lower education ability of, and because of that, there's higher crime rates and all this kind of stuff in developing countries, even in our own country, in different populations. And it's easy for us to say it's a systematic problem. And it's like people aren't given the chances and all that. And in that, it's very easy to see that. It's very clear. It's true. It's obvious. But in an interpersonal reaction, we get so emotionally charged that we can't use that same logic. You know what I mean? Does that make any sense? So it's easy to see that like conditioning is real. People are a product of circumstances, that all of these kind of circumstances and conditioning from like birth to death are influencing who they are, how they act, all of those things. But when it's in an emotionally charged situation, like someone harming us or someone we care about, we throw that away and we think, no, you're wrong, you're real, the conditions don't matter. You know what I mean? I think that's what we do. And so what this is telling us is, no, they're out of control. They're not in their right minds. They're not in control. They're under the power of their negative emotions, of their anger and so forth. And because of that, we shouldn't get angry at them. So that's the first point. The second point is the fault of your own karma. And this one, I don't expect you to accept or anything, because I assume that most people, or at least I'm going to just throw it out there, that at least half of you maybe don't have a full certain trust or belief in past and future lives, or the principle of karma from past lives and all that kind of stuff. But I'll just explain it so you can understand it in the Buddhist context of what they're talking about and how someone who's practicing traditional Buddhism might reconcile this for themselves. So in the Buddhist teachings on karma, it does not say that every situation that happens to you is a product of your karma. How you react to it is a product of your karma. Certain situations might be a product of your karma, but they always say that everything that happens to you is a circumstance of your past karma meeting with present circumstances. So let's say I walk out in the street and some car hits me. It's not necessarily because of my karma. It might have just been because that person wasn't paying attention, or there was a bump in the road that knocked their wheel or something like that. That has nothing to do with my karma. So, but there are teachings in the Buddhist teachings of karma, very specific types of teachings that say, like, if you were someone who was, let's say in your past life, you were oppressing other people, you were harming other people, or even killing other people, they'll say that in your next life, even if you do get to be a human again, which is not likely if you were killing people or harming people or whatever, you're more likely to take birth in one of these other more negative realms or whatever. Even if you were to take rebirth as a human, you would have more obstacles in your life. You wouldn't live very long. You would experience oppression and all this kind of stuff. So that's how this, this talk of like harms coming to you as a product of your own karma, that's the context from what they're talking about. So they're saying that if in the past you were harming others, you were being, I don't know, you were speaking poorly to others, denigrating others, criticizing others, whatever, in this life, you're going to experience something very similar to that. So, for someone that really believes in karma, this is actually really powerful and it's actually really helpful. And for people that don't believe in karma, a lot of people want to say, where's the justice? That's not fair. But really, it's not even a discussion of that, because there is no you that existed in the past life that's the same as the you that exists in this life, according to the actual teachings on rebirth. It's more that there is a continuity of consciousness that's not necessarily connected to your identity as me. And that carries these subtle habitual patterns, which are impressions left from lifetime to lifetime, which become like habitual patterning of the way you might experience things, no matter what kind of physical experience you might end up in a future life. So I don't want to harp on this too much, because some of you guys probably don't even believe in past and future lives and like too much about karma. But generally, on a more just simple level, karma is much more to do with just habitual patterning. Just to not go on too long about it, but you can, even if you don't think about it in terms of past and future lives, it's kind of like everything that you do is leaving a subtle impression in your mind that makes it that much easier to do or experience something like that again in the future. And so even in this life, that could be the kind of thing. I think a lot of people, when they're just kind of thinking about, maybe you're going to think I'm crazy for saying this, but I think paranoid people are the people who get stolen from. Trusting people who actually are just kind of like honest and have some self-confidence and are trustworthy of other people, they build that trust with other people, even subconsciously. And I think it's often, in my experience, like in India, I lived in India for a long time, and there are a lot of Westerners, and it was always the people who paranoid, locked their bags up everywhere in the trains. They're always the people that got their stuff stolen. And it was like me and my friends who were like dirt bags, like living on the train, just like camping out with like the local Indian people and sharing meals with them, that like you just like develop friendships and everyone's nice to you and they look out for you and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm just saying that like I think that when you put out a certain energy of like paranoia and distrust, it attracts an energy of harm. And this is me speaking. This isn't traditional Buddhist text, but I'm trying to give a little bit of an experiential thing about what maybe this mental habitual patterning, and the way that can actually manifest in terms of your experience of harm. So just trying to connect that a little bit. And I'm not sure if that made sense, and we can just move on from that point. But the next, it says, this one sounds really far out too. So I think that like a few of these are going to make a lot of sense and be super helpful, and some of them are going to be kind of far out. So the next one, it says, considering the fault of your physical existence. And so this one is like really far out, because it says, if you reflect in this way, if I didn't even have this body, then other people's weapons and illnesses and these kind of things could never affect me. So it's only because I have a body that you can hurt me anyway. So therefore it's stupid for me to fight back at them. And it sounds silly, but it is like getting back to the idea of the Buddhist idea of interdependence. Interdependence, and the interdependence ultimately relates to the concept of emptiness, that only because there is this kind of dependent situation, that because there's a me, there's a you, because there's a, without the me, there could be no you, without a body to harm, there could be no harmer, without a harmee, there could be no harmer. It's kind of a philosophical idea. It's not like literally because you have a body. If you just said it's because you have a body, that just seems silly, right? It's actually about interdependence. So it's like without a harmer or a harmee, someone to receive harm, there could be no harmer. And so it's more of a philosophical point. The next one is considering the fault of mind. And it says that it is my mind. It's actually just a perspective, kind of. Like it's only my perspective to think that that thing that someone did is a harm to me. I choose to decide to identify it as harm. And I know that's far out too, but it is like it is, in a way, you can choose how you interpret situations. And I know it doesn't feel like a choice because we're driven by the power of our habitual patterns, but let's say someone says something harmful to me, but I'm a person who is training in letting other people being right and me just taking the loss. I'm training in that on purpose because I'm practicing this path of the Bodhisattva. There are a lot of mind training texts that say, give everyone else the victory, take on the loss. It's a way of kind of subduing your ego and kind of giving a gift to others, letting them be right, whatever, that kind of thing. In that situation, someone says something rude to me, or someone says something that I know is wrong, but instead I let them be right. And in that moment, I'm making a decision about how I react. I'm making a decision about whether I interpret that as criticism or harm, or whether I'm taking that as some kind of spiritual training. So the point of the considering the fault of mind is that more or less our minds are kind of habituated to interpreting things in a certain way. We're sensitive to certain types of phenomena, certain types of actions and speech and so forth. And because of that, we interpret things and experience things as harmful, but they're not. The situation itself is not ultimately in and of itself harmful. Of course, there are some, if someone like stabbed you or something, that is physically harmful. But even then, it's still a mental decision at a certain point, whether you interpret that as harmful or whether you interpret that as like a voluntary taking on of suffering or whatever. I know that sounds really far out, but there is a decision there that you could make about how to interpret a situation. And so then, considering that there's no difference of fault. So the quote from the text, it says, some through ignorance make harm, others through ignorance get angry at them. Who among them is faultless? Who is at fault? So if out of the other person's ignorance, they hurt you, and then out of your ignorance, you get angry back at them, you're both equally at fault, is the point. So basically, you have to relate all of this back to a certain extent, back to the idea of a being who is trying to practice to get enlightened. And another big point of this is that in the practice of bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, and as a person who in this practice is, let's say that you have fully committed to that path, there is something called the bodhisattva vows. The primary amongst those vows is to never abandon love for all living beings, no matter what they do. And so that love means wishing them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. So if you are truly practicing the path of a bodhisattva, you should be working in whatever way necessary to never wish to harm any living being and to never be angry at any living being. And so this is like the context in which this is working. So if some of these ideas seem kind of far out or radical, it's a radical pursuit. Like bodhicitta, the path of the bodhisattva, is a radical thing. It's not like a ordinary worldly, I think I want to be less angry kind of situation. So just so you understand that some of these pieces of advice that are pretty far out, pretty deep, pretty weird, they are like within that context. So like, I hope that even if you're not seeing the world in that context, that you can extract some little bits that are maybe more practical for you and try and put those into, and I'll try and talk about some more of that later, some more of the practical stuff. I just want to go through a little bit of the technical stuff, to kind of give honor to the actual like traditional teaching of the perfections. Otherwise, I would be like saying that it's a teaching about the perfections and ignoring the actual teaching of the perfections and just talking about general patience wouldn't even be the point. So then there's this teaching, the practical utility, which means that if I want to develop patience, I have to go through some stuff. I have to experience some harm, or else I can't. You don't develop patience by sitting around doing nothing. So there's a funny story of I don't know if any of you saw, there was a maybe it hasn't gone out yet. Anyway, I made a little video that's going to be on our social media channels, that there's a famous teacher in Tibet named Patrul Rinpoche, and he was kind of a prankster, and he was a very high teacher, very revered lama, but he always walked around in just tattered old like nomad's clothes. He never wore like the regalia, nice robes of a lama. So one time he was walking along and there was a guy sitting next to a temple and he was meditating there, and Patrul Rinpoche stopped and he said, "Hey, what are you meditating on?" And the guy said, "Patience." And Patrul Rinpoche walked another 10, 15 steps away, just within earshot, and he goes, "Some dirty fake monks these days are hanging around trying to beg for money, pretending to meditate." And he just, he's just poking at this guy. And the guy goes, "What did you say?" And Patrul Rinpoche looks back at him and he goes, "Patience, patience." So anyway, the idea is that like, you're not going to develop patience by sitting around doing nothing or just imagining some situation, but you have to actually go through some stuff to develop patience. So another way, this is a kind of almost like a circular argument or a loop, but like one way of developing patience is recognizing that you have to go through harm to develop patience. So that can make you more patient. Recognizing, well, if I want to become more patient, I got to go through the shit, I got to move through this. I got to experience something bad. And so then the next is recognizing the enormous kindness. And so this one, it says that recognizing that without developing the perfection of patience, you can't attain enlightenment. And therefore, the person who does that harmful thing is incredibly kind to you, because it's in reliance upon that situation with them that you can develop patience. So there's some other famous quotes that say that in terms of attaining enlightenment, the Buddhas or the Buddha and ordinary sentient beings are equal in their kindness to us, because it is in this practice of the six perfections, it's only through our relations with other people, our interactions and our ways of dealing with them through these six principles that we can actually develop ourselves. And so we don't do that in isolation. So like you can't practice generosity without someone to be generous with. You can't practice discipline. Like most of the discipline is about like not harming others, not killing others. And on the opposites, it's about helping others and protecting life. So all of those principles and in patience as well are all, practiced by interacting with other people in other situations. So it's said that like without those people, you can't attain enlightenment. So that's talking about, considering the great kindness. Then it says, consider that the Buddhas will be delighted. This one maybe is pretty far out for some of you guys. Traditional Buddhists, they're into this kind of thing, but a lot of us like to think that there are these enlightened beings that are like that know what we're doing. And if they see us like following through with these teachings and not getting angry and being patient, then they're going to be really stoked about that. They're going to be like, woohoo, good job. Like, so anyway, maybe that seems silly to you, but like to traditional Buddhists and like, a lot of people really believe this kind of stuff. And so that's another thing. It's like, it's kind of like if you want to please your partner by doing something that you committed to and they like to see you follow through, or like your parents or your coach or whatever, like you have a gym coach and your coach is happy for you when you make that progress or whatever. It's the same kind of thing. It's that same kind of principle, like here, like for someone that believes in the presence of omniscient beings in the world who like see what you're doing or whatever. Maybe you don't believe that, that's fine. But I just want you guys to know like the context in which this is happening. So, and so then considering the tremendous benefit of that. So basically the tremendous benefit is everything that we already talked about before. Like you'll stay calm, you'll keep your peace, you'll be able to sleep, you'll attain enlightenment, ultimately all that kind of stuff. You'll foster good relationships, all those things. So there is another set of 5 kind of instructions here. I think these ones are kind of following in the same line, but one is recognizing the harmer as someone dear to your heart. And so this is coming back to the Bodhisattva vow. And so that in these teachings on the Bodhisattva vow and on the practice of the Bodhisattva, it's always mentioned, like I said before, that you have this commitment to never abandon love for all beings, to kind of treat beings as if they are your only child, that kind of thing. They give an example like that. All sentient beings are your only child. And it's like, you're a mother with no hands whose child is carried away in a river. And so like, you're trying really hard to do these practices so that you can develop the power that you could actually help them. Right now, you're powerless. Like, you're like a mother with no hands whose child was swept away in the river. And so like, you're doing these practices, like all the 6 perfections and so forth, in order to develop the power, the spiritual power, the forbearance, the patience, the power of generosity and discipline and all these things that will enable you to actually be of some more tangible benefit in the future for other beings. So basically that's what it's saying. Like, if you recognize that all beings are like your only child and you're like their mother, then even the person that's harming you should be considered in the same light. And so recognizing the harmer as a mere phenomenal reality. So this is another one of those things that's more about like emptiness. So it says that it means that this is only taking place dependent on conditions. So of course, I know that for most of you, if you hear that kind of statement, you think, well, of course, everything only is dependent on conditions. But that's where the teachings of emptiness become really profound, because I think that most of us in the West, with scientific kind of often kind of critical analysis type of thinking, because we go through classes on math and science and all kinds of things like this that make us have some kind of critical thinking. When you hear teachings that nothing truly exists in and of itself, everything is dependent on other conditions, we think, oh yeah, of course. But that's not how our minds actually interact with the world. We don't see that everything is just dependent on conditions. Like the example I gave you before, we want to say, no, this person's real, they're a jerk, they're mean. We don't see that they're a product of conditions. We don't see that they are an ongoing process of a person is an ongoing process of conditioning. They're not some kind of solid thing that is this or that. And so that one's a little bit hard to talk about without getting deeper into the whole teaching of emptiness. But the idea is, by seeing that harmer is still just a product of conditions, that they're not like a singular, solid, independent entity, which is a jerk or is a harmer or whatever, you can overcome that sense of them as a harmer and overcome your anger that could come about as a result of that. I think that I want to summarize a little bit, because I don't want to go on too long going through each and every point in the text. And there are some other points that are made sometimes in the text, which are not specifically about this, but connected to this. Like, sometimes these methods are not going to work. That's one thing that I had, in my notes. I want to talk about this, because so if you think about some of these things, and you have to give this some contemplation and go through some of these things to like maybe have some of these things be effective for you. And it is true that in the teachings of the perfections, that that the general kind of definition or defining characteristics of patience, like I said before, is a mind that's undisturbed, a mind that doesn't want to react or reply to their harm, and a mind that doesn't hold on to this kind of sense that you hurt me, like we're not fixated on that. But as a beginner who's like just trying to get over or trying to deal with a situation and hoping not to react in anger, Shantideva in the Bodhisattva's Way of Life gives another piece of advice. And he says, just be like a piece of wood. So a piece of wood doesn't react. It doesn't think. It doesn't fight back. So in that instance, what he's saying, and Namchak Khenri Rinpoche and Tupasanak Rinpoche, there's a video that we linked as well of Tupasanak Rinpoche talking about, he says, what should you do when your mind is rising up like an angry snake, or something like that is the name of the video. But Khenri Rinpoche often talks about anger as, I think everyone probably has a general experience of this, that when you are first experiencing anger, before it bursts out, you feel it energetically, like rising up. You can feel a tension like in your body, in your chest, sometimes specifically in your heart. And if you can recognize that when it first happens and just stop yourself from reacting, like it's physically like you're just shutting yourself down in that situation, but you're doing it because you recognize that you're not going to do anything good. You're not going to react in a good or wholesome or positive or constructive or harmonious way while that energy is still there. And so that's where Shantideva says, be like a piece of wood. Don't say anything. Don't think anything. Just sit. And so just be still. And that energy, so this is another thing in Buddhism, we often talk about energy and mind being more or less the same thing. That's another topic. I don't want to get too much into it, but basically when you feel that energy rising up, as long as that ball of tension is still there, you're probably not going to react in a wholesome or harmonious way. And so if you can just pause, take some deep breaths, let that settle, calm yourself, then try to discuss whatever the situation was. For beginners, I think that's a really good first step, for working with anger. While you're doing that, you can try to implement some of these practices that we talked about, some of these ideas of recognizing the harm doer as being an object of my loving kindness or whatever, that kind of thing, that I should feel like a debt of gratitude to them because it's only by my reactions or my interactions with other beings and harm doers that I can develop this power of patience, ultimately attain enlightenment, all that kind of thing. Those are like kind of, things that need some more time to develop. And, like I said, I think that initially, right off the bat, that may not take root. That may not be very effective at countering your anger right now, just by thinking about it for a few minutes, And I think that ultimately, some of the contemplations on emptiness and selflessness and impermanence can be some of the most meaningful, which really has to do with that principle of conditioning that I talked about before. Because in a certain light, sorry, my phone is ringing and I thought I had sorry. In a certain light, the principle of dependent arising or interdependence and the meaning of emptiness is identical. So in the Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, we generally use the word emptiness, meaning that things are not truly or independently existent, that they only exist in relation to other things or independence on other causes and conditions. So one way to talk about it is from this perspective of saying that things are empty. Another way of talking about them is to say that they are dependently arisen or that they exist in interdependence. So that's coming back to that position of talking about conditioning, that I said that like it's really easy for us a lot of times to recognize that certain situations arise because of conditioning, because of cultural conditioning, political conditioning, historical context, all those things. In those lights, often it's easy for us to recognize that and therefore have some grace in the way that we judge or criticize those types of situations or assess or feel compassion or whatever for those types of situations. Whereas in a situation of someone who's annoying us or harming us, it's hard for us to apply that same understanding, but that's where we really could put some more thought. And I think that's probably the most tangible and most realistic tactic for most of you, for the people that maybe don't have a certainty about past and future lives, maybe don't really believe about karmic ripenings in future lives and those kind of things. So I think that point of conditioning is probably like the key for most of you. I don't want to say what some of these other things might have resonated very clearly for you, and I would love for you to explore those if they do. But I think on a general sense, like that the idea of conditioning is probably the one, interdependence, and that everything arises because of conditioning and because of interdependent factors is probably the one that is the most easy to understand and maybe most effective to apply. So I think that we're about at the time to break off into discussion groups. I don't know what time did you have scheduled, Rachel, or do we have a schedule? I don't even know.
Yeah, this is a good time if you're ready.
Sure.
So at this point in our time together, let me just remove spotlight. Okay.
And then I was trying to like rush through the outline of the traditional stuff and then forgot to bring up this point. This is one thing that Ken Rinpoche's talked about at a lot of our retreats when I was translating. And, there's certain things about Buddhist practice that you have to meditate to kind of like overcome or to develop your capacity for. And there are certain things that just by understanding something in a different way, it totally frees you from the problem. And one of those things is related to anger. And it is when you're just not in the moment with someone who ticked you off or did something wrong to you or harmful to you, but when you're sitting and thinking about it after the fact and burning in anger and getting, upset. All that is happening right there is like you holding a flame in your hand and refusing to let go. Like a burning coal in your hand. You can't, no matter how much you think of the situation in your mind, you're not getting back at them. You're only hurting yourself. You're not getting to a resolution about the situation. You're just hurting yourself. Like the example that's often given is like squeezing. You're just squeezing even harder on a flame or like a hot coal. And so just by recognizing, I think we don't recognize what we're doing. And we think somehow like that if I sit around and stew in my anger, somehow I'm like getting back at them or something. I think subconsciously we think that like that somehow this is going to make me feel better. And it doesn't at all. It's just like, stabbing yourself, it's like you're fighting with an idea you have of that person in your own head. So you're just like fighting with your own mind. And so just to like, when you get upset and you're just like stewing and thinking over and over, just try to reflect on that. Think about what is this actually doing? Is this actually helping me? Is this going to make me any happier? And just pause, like try and think about that. Like give yourself a little bit of like critical analysis, like look inward and try and stop the process and think about it for a second. And it can really help you drop it. It might not permanently, it might come up again. It might take doing it again and again and again to get to the point where you kind of stop doing it. But in the beginning, you have to mindfully like recognize what you're doing, pause and think about it. But it's really helpful. And that's something I would highly suggest as well. So let's go to some questions. If we have any. You can put them in the chat or you can turn on your microphone, whatever you prefer.
And just so you all know, no one will be videoed because we have Justin spotlighted, so we'll just hear your voice. But if you'd rather put your question in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. And I'm happy to read it for you.
Well, maybe I'll go first. Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about the Dharma and the term again, because I almost need it in front of me. Paramitas.
Yeah.
Hey, I got it right. It's an important subject, and you're very eloquent in the way that you kind of discuss it and explain it from a modern day practical lens with a kind of a spiritual and religious layers. I really like how you break that down. I'm following all of it, but applying it, that that's a stinky bugger here. So trying to figure out how to do that. I guess one of the questions that I have is what there's a lot of layers, there's a lot of complexity to kind of analyzing this from day to day, from before the trigger to when the trigger happens, to how I feel about it, to how I think about it, to how I behave. And I realize there's a lot that I can do after the fact. But what's the simplest thing that I can do when I'm in the moment and my mind is not distinguishing all those things? I'm just really attached to the emotion. My brain is on fire. I want to open a door and just let it out one way or another. Are you thinking that that I just need to take a breath to create that second and a half distance so that I can at least cut the intensity in half and not overreact? I'm trying. I have like a mantra of just be patient, just take a second. Or is there a better way to just kind of redivert some of that energy?
I would say that first of all, just the fact that you're even thinking about it is already taking the first step. So this is like sowing the seeds for starting to be able to recognize it and do something when it happens in the future. So we're already like making some progress. So second, so now you're kind of setting an intention to do something about it, right? So that just even having that intention and keeping that intention is going to help you to be more mindful when it happens. But I would say like that in that moment, the best thing you can do is just try to, first of all, remember how bad anger is for you and for the situation and for your relationships. That's going to be like, I think, a really powerful thing. When you can start to really recognize that in yourself, because now that you're starting to think about this, every time you get angry, you're going to start thinking about it and experiencing it through that lens. If you take this seriously, which it sounds like you do, you're going to start experiencing your anger through this lens of how it's harming you, how it might be showing itself and affecting the other people around you, potentially harming your relationships and so forth. And that's going to start building momentum towards like helping you to deal with this in better and better ways. But I would say that like in the early stages, the best thing you can do is try to recognize that it's happening. In that moment, try and recognize that it's not going to do you any good, and try and take some deep breaths and let it settle before you start reacting. And then all of these other kind of techniques of contemplating the interdependence, thinking about all of these other factors, trying to think of the situation as being really important in your spiritual development. Maybe that'll take longer to settle in, or maybe you're not even interested in working with those techniques. But I think initially, just the fact that we're already talking about it, the fact that you sound interested in trying to do it, that's already going to start making you more able to recognize it when it happens. And then you can gradually start. I mean, first of all, you'll get better as you do it. And the more you start to recognize those things in your day-to-day emotional reactions and so forth, the more that you'll develop the power to not just recognize that you are, but in that moment of recognition, do something about it, do something practical, So, I think that it's going to be a process. And I think in the beginning, you just got to start with recognizing the faults and trying to kind of let it settle. And just saying, just be patient, I don't think is helpful. I think that's kind of trying to force something away, and you kind of just have to let the energy dissipate. You kind of just have to take some deep breaths. I think that forcefully holding it in is different than recognizing that it's happening and letting it go. And I think that's the more effective technique. And that it's not going to be that easy in the beginning, especially in a very emotionally charged situation, So I hope that's helpful. I don't know, we can continue the.
Yeah. So there's that just strengthening our recognition of, this might go wrong. Letting it out with that breath. So what is the best way to recognize that? What kind of, I guess, like labeling or noting techniques have you found helpful?
I think for me, it's energetic more than anything. I can feel the energy of the anger before I can recognize. I can feel the tension in my body or in my heart before I can recognize intellectually that something's happening or that I'm going to react in a certain way. Like I can feel it energetically, and maybe different people are sensitive in different ways, so that might not work for you. But for me, that's the best thing. And like I said, when you start applying this, kind of moving forward, you'll become more and more sensitive to that energetic shift and be able to recognize it earlier and earlier before it becomes problematic. It's only when that energy has fully like exploded that there's going to be an outpour or a harsh reaction or a slamming of a door or a shout or whatever. If you can catch it when it's the first stages of that feeling in your heart or whatever, then you're in a much better position because that energy hasn't fully swelled to the point where it's like powerful and overwhelming. You know what I mean? So that for me, that's the kind of crux of the matter, is like recognizing it early. And for me, it's a sensitivity to that energy.
Yeah, I love that, because often, even in meditation practice, I will try to I actually forget, because I haven't been using the noting techniques for a little while because I haven't found them to be too helpful, where I'm using these like greed and aversion, and it's just like, then I'm like, well, is this greed or is this aversion? And I get lost in the noting, and it's just, so it doesn't quite, it's trying to get too technical about it. But what you're referring to is like this soft noting is like, oh, I'm getting angry, oh, I'm getting overwhelmed. It's very subtle, and I don't have to think about it too much before I start to implement that. Just take a breath, let it go. So that's really helpful.
Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, Justin. My name's Tammy. I kind of missed just a piece of what you were saying when you were talking about recognizing the harmer as someone dear to your heart, recognizing the harmer as a mirror to something.
Let me.
It was just before you were talking about being like a piece of wood.
Yep. Let's see here. It's right here. Recognizing the harmer as someone dear to your heart. Recognize the harmer as a mere phenomenal reality was the second one. And that was like the thing about interdependence and conditioning and all that.
Okay.
There are more of these. Recognizing the harmer's suffering is another one. I didn't bring that up, but recognizing that they are suffering and that's why they are acting in that way. That brings in the compassion element, especially in this bodhisattva practice, which is really important. That like someone wouldn't be acting out in a harmful way if they weren't themselves in a state of discomfort or suffering. So that's another pretty crucial one there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, the other one, I actually jumped off before I talked about the last one, and it's pretty kind of obvious. It says, and we mentioned it a little bit, but it was take the patience as the voluntary taking on of suffering. And basically that just means that like to develop patience, you're going to have to go through some stuff, and to practice the Dharma, you're going to have to go through some stuff. Like it's not easy to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do a hardcore meditation retreat. It's not easy to make a commitment to certain behavior or whatever, to like stop doing certain harmful things. It's not easy to follow through with a daily practice or certain practice commitments that some of us take in certain situations along the Buddhist path. So that's like, when they say a voluntary acceptance of suffering, it just means that like things are going to be hard and you do it knowing it's going to be hard because you know that there's some great benefit in doing that. Yeah.
That answered my question anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and back on.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. We got 2 Tammys.
I had a question. So you hear, or I have heard frequently about, Buddhist masters keeping somebody pesky and annoying with them while they're on the path. As you're meditating and you've taken on, some diligence to behave in certain ways, and you start noticing those patterns, and then you notice that you're engaging, that your relationships had that pattern, so you stop gossiping, and then you have somebody in your life who gossips. So and you're already not reacting to that, and you're like, oh, I understand that your life has brought you to this point, and this is the way that you do things. Where does the discernment of I'm presenting myself with this thing that's out of alignment, or is this lean in and stay on the
this is a tricky thing.
I know it's tricky.
And I'll just say that this is why Buddhism is complicated, and why a lot of people will try and say Buddhism is this or that, or the Buddha said you should do this or that, and they take that as a single-sided statement that should apply to any and all situations, and that's just never the case. The Buddha was always teaching according to where a person is in their path of development. So in certain circumstances, the Buddha would tell you, don't hang out with that person anymore because they're harming your spiritual development. At other points in your practice, the Buddha would say, gossip with them because it's a way for them to be able to interact with you more, and you might be able to positively influence them. So you should gossip with them because that's what they're into. And that's going to through gossiping with them, you might be able to throw in some little nuggets of wisdom or helpful advice or whatever. So that's up to you to kind of decide, is their gossiping drawing you away from your goals? Is it affecting you in a negative way? Or is it something that you feel like you value the relationship, or you feel that you could be helpful to them in some way, such to the extent that that it's a more positive net benefit of keeping the relationship or something like that, So, that's just one of those things. And it gets tricky too, when you get into this whole world of Buddhism, and this sense of there is a sense for certain people at certain points in their practice, it's of kind of separating from worldly experiences or worldly interactions and just focusing on the spiritual life. And there are a lot of people who have kind of phases of that. I can say for myself, I had a phase of very renunciate type of life, and a phase of kind of reintegrating with society and things like that. And it might just be a phase in your own development that is feeling a sense of wanting to pull away until you feel a more grounded sense where those type of situations don't affect you. So it really is a very personal, individual type of thing. I don't know if that made sense or not, but
That was super helpful, actually. Thank you.
yeah, there's there's all kinds of these lists of numbered things in Buddhism. There's the 4 of these and the 6 of those and whatever, but there's the 4 kind of 4 ways of gathering people around you. And this is for a Buddha or a teacher who's trying to positively influence people around them. And one of them is speaking in accordance with the interests of that person. So if that person's really into hunting, even if you're somewhat morally opposed to hunting, you should talk to them about their hunting. Oh, that's cool. What kind of bow do you have? How do you hunt? What animals do you hunt? Where do you go? Just to be friendly with them and try and engage with them in a way that they feel closer to you. And maybe that interaction could be somehow meaningful for them, or maybe you could share some other kinds of advice with them along the way. And, that's spoken from in the context of a teacher or a person who's trying to share the teachings or whatever. But I think that the same principle can apply just if you're thinking about your process of development. At a certain point, it may be that those types of relationships are kind of feeling harmful or stressing or distracting from your kind of spiritual goals. And at a certain point, you may feel you have a certain level at which that stuff doesn't matter anymore and you can reintegrate or whatever. I don't know. So that's very individual. And I definitely don't recommend people breaking off from their worldly relationships to pursue unless you want to run off and become a monk or a nun and literally become a renunciate and live in a monastery or something. I definitely think that if you practice these teachings in a way and work with a teacher and have community to talk to, it just depends. Certain people take teachings in a way that makes them feel more separate from the people around them, when, you know, I think that's a phase, and I think it's a phase that you should be really careful about, because I think that if you really go deeper into the teachings, especially in the traditional Buddhist teachings, the deeper you understand the teachings, the more connected you should feel with other people, and the more understanding of their circumstances, the more sympathetic of their, you know, their realities. Like, even if you might from a certain perspective say that their reality is not the ultimate reality or whatever, I think that's a position that a lot of people get into. They start to understand emptiness and interdependence, and they think this person's not acting in accordance with reality, they're in their own ego trip or whatever, but that's real for them. And because that's real for them, that's the life that they live and the experience that they have, the emotions that they feel, and that's all real to them. And to say that it's not because of your philosophical position is just kind of bullshit. And it's judgmental and it's mean. So it's a you know, it's a little bit of a tight or a slim line to walk, you know, like to start to understand or start to go deeper into some kind of other understanding of reality, some deeper understanding of like the operations of the mind, but not letting that become a cause for, I don't know. I don't say that everyone shouldn't do that. I think there's a time and a place for certain people who want to go deep into that kind of stuff. Sure, cut off all your relations, go be a monk or a nun, whatever, do that. But I don't think that's for most people. And I think that if you allow that to happen, if you allow that to negatively affect your relationships, if you fall into that kind of spiritual, judgmental kind of attitude, it can be really destructive to your own life and your own path, you know. I've seen it happen, and I can say I've done it to a certain extent, and that's why I can like talk about it in a pretty confident way.
Yeah. And that's why I asked, because it's like I have this knowing that like, oh no, I can be this way with some people, but then other people, you know, that ego gets in and you forget, you know, some of the equanimity and it hurts. And you're like, I don't
Yeah,
want to hurt.
yeah.
Yeah. And I want to be connected. So yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
It isn't that the problem though, in a lot of the, like when we're talking about patience and trying to understand why other people are exuding anger, isn't it the ego that is driving it all anyways?
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, when you go into like the source of afflictive thoughts and emotions, which are the source then of harmful actions or speech or whatever, it all comes down to, you know, self-centered attitude, and that's, you know, separation, that I'm more important than you and my needs are more important than yours and all of that. So yeah. How do we identify that line, healthy from unhealthy practice? I would say that by and large, one thing that I've seen time and time again is that people start to intellectualize what should be true or what should be real. And then they start using that intellectualization of the teachings to judge other people's experiences, when what you should be doing is taking these like existential truths of reality or whatever, applying them to your own mind, allowing that to develop however it develops in terms of like your shifting thought process, your increasing realizations, whatever. And that will be a natural expression of the teachings, which should, you know, express itself with compassion and equanimity and like embracing others and all that kind of thing, as opposed to this kind of like surface level understanding, which you then kind of use as a basis for criticizing or judging other people. And I think that for people that are just practicing and that are not falling into that trap of intellectualizing, then they rarely have those kind of problems. Like I can say, I know a lot of Westerners and Tibetans who have reached like really, really high levels of practice and years of retreat. They're not aloof, like spacey, divorced from reality, uncompassionate, unloving people. They're like, they have loving relationships and they're kind people and they engage with their communities, you know, so.
So I have a question that kind of like incorporates a few things that have been touched on, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Um, so my question kind of comes from a place of parenting, as someone who has been listening to the Dharma, attending sangha, studying the teachings of Buddha for a while now, at least I would say almost a year. And then while living in the South. So this is where I'm starting from. Now, it's not easy to follow through as one of your my favorite things that you said, because it's not, and especially when it becomes to discipline with a child. So, and then also teachings of a child. So I have an 8-year-old who's very mental special needs. She's got a lot of mood disorders and ADHD, you name it. She's had 2 hospitalizations. It's pretty rough. So when I'm dealing with her in like heightened emotion situations, I have obviously found that like not reacting is the better of the two, because it just heightens her ladder. She has a counselor that's very centered in mindfulness. Imagine that, right, in the middle of Alabama. That was great. But when she has been like screaming at me for 2.5, 3 hours, whatever, the cops have been called, this, that, and the other. How do you maintain equanimity, and how do you maintain patience in there? Like, where does that line of I'm being patient with you, but I am also teaching you lie? And then I guess the second follow-up question would be, how would one, I mean, obviously I teach her the Paramitas without her knowing. I've actually had her recite some of them in Sanskrit. And I mean, so obviously she knows these values and these virtues and these wonderful things and these wonderful ways to be, but how would you start to incorporate Buddhist teachings into a child's life? Because I don't think that should be absent at all.
I think that the biggest way that as a very young child that they're going to learn is by seeing the example in their parents.
Right.
And one of the hardest things, I mean, I don't know, your situation sounds like an extreme one. It's not like simple. It's not like a simple, like my kid acts up sometimes. How do I not get mad? And, but I think that the biggest thing in this situation, I mean, there's a lot to this. There's a lot to unpack in that. And I'm not a therapist. And I think that's like,
yeah, I don't think you're one. It's just more of a question of patience, and then like the Dharma to a child.
I think that in terms of your way of trying to adopt this, I think that the easiest way for a parent to relate with their kids in terms of these techniques that we talked about is like just overarching like compassion for her. Because it's like she's obviously like experiencing some serious like mental and physical turmoil that's causing her to act out in that way. So you can obviously see that like it's not, and once again, not to like make it a blameless situation, but like she's under the control of this crazy power of emotion, of physical and emotional disturbances, And so in terms of you trying to maintain your not getting upset, I think that just by trying to even increase, I know you already have love and compassion, it's your child, but like even more, try and see this whole situation through that lens. And when it comes to correcting behavior, try and see it through that lens, that like compassion doesn't mean, okay, do whatever you want. It means I want the best for you. I want you to have a successful life. It means I want you to have I want you to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And if she's going to be continuing to act in ways that are destructive for her own life, you have to wish for and try to get her on a path of not engaging in behavior that's going to continue negatively affecting her life. I know it's easier said than done, especially in a situation with physical and mental health issues, right. But I think in terms of your intention, and that's going to be the primary thing. The actual things that you do, I think you need to discuss with your therapist and with your doctors. But in terms of your intention, no, I'm just saying, but I think what I can give you advice on is how to keep your intention in terms of working from that state. If you're working from a state of pure love, which And when I say love, I don't just mean the attached love of a mother to their child. I mean like really wishing for her to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And in this context of Dharma, the causes of happiness are wholesome actions, wholesome speech, good, the 10 virtues, whatever, that kind of thing. Wishing her to have those things and trying to show her a path and trying to get her on a path of those, more so than talking about abstract philosophical virtues. Just doing good, doing wholesome things, and recognizing that that's what's going to make you happy, and that's what's going to set forth a path to happiness in the future. I think that's more effective and like more practical for her at this point. And if she can get to a more stable point, then you can introduce more philosophical kinds of ideas of Buddhist principles or whatever. I don't think the time is ripe for that right now. If she's just like violently outpouring, telling her about a bunch of philosophy is not going to help.
I kind of may have conveyed that a little bit wrong. She was at like really badly, but like she's come down to a point of where we're starting to work with her patience and her focus, and then like she is having outbursts and then coming back, and then she's starting to feel remorse, and she's starting to feel those feelings. And so I wasn't trying to say that I'm trying to pour out philosophy on this poor little girl.
No, yeah. I just mean in terms of like techniques of introducing her to Dharma. I think one of the fundamental things is just good conduct before you even get into meditation and stuff like that. Because if you're acting in ways that are harmful to yourself and others, whether that is even just like by being rude and stuff like that, you're going to be in a state that is like disturbed, physically and mentally disturbed, even on a subtle level. It's going to prevent you from really developing higher level spiritual qualities. Like that's why when we're talking about the paramitas, you have generosity and then discipline and then patience, and then all these up. Meditation is fifth.
Right.
Like if you're not acting like in a good way, in a wholesome way, in a kind way, if you're not able to be patient, you're probably not going to be able to meditate. Right. So like conduct is like really important. And that's why I Rachel, I don't mean this to criticize you. I think this is a little bit of Namchak lingo, but we often talk about Buddhist meditation practices, and Justin's a meditation teacher. This teaching right here has nothing to do with meditation. In Buddhism, meditation is just one tiny part of Buddhism. I think a lot of people in the West think Buddhism, they think, oh, meditation, Zen, whatever, you just sit on a cushion. But Buddhism is like a whole like set of practices and ways of contemplating life that all are encouraging and developing into meditation and wisdom and that kind of thing. But meditation is like one branch. It's kind of like in yoga, people think of yoga as physical postures, but within the traditional yoga, you have 8 branches of yoga. Within that, there's karma yoga, like doing good actions, helpful actions. There's jnana yoga, there's like wisdom, like learning the text and everything. So same in Buddhism, there's like, it's often in the West gets reduced to just meditation, but like that's really just one small thing. Like a big part of Buddhism is gaining wisdom, gaining insight into understanding the way your mind works, contemplating things in a way that will help you to not get upset. But that's not meditation, that's just contemplation, that's study, that's a new way of contextualizing your life or your experience. So there's in this, I think that a lot of people in the West's adoption of Buddhist practices, they really ignore all of the other aspects, which are the supports upon which you could build a successful meditation practice. And they just try and jump to meditation practice with no structure to support it, So that's just my kind of advice for you, is like, if I could say, and just take this with a grain of salt, like with your intention, come from that pure point of love and compassion, and with like fundamentals, start from the basics, of good conduct, of helpful, the 10 virtues. There's a blog on our website if you want to look at about karma and the 10 virtues and stuff like that. I know it sounds simple. I know it sounds like hyper basic and like, oh,
no,
something more or something, but it's like so important.
That's exactly the answer I was looking for. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. Anything else? You can also go off topic if you don't have anything else to talk about patience.
Well, and I know we're running out of time because many people are probably running off to eat dinner. But I had a question that I also put in the chat.
Oh, yeah,
You talked a little bit about how we're out in the world and things happen, and we always interpret things from kind of a it's about me point. And yeah, my mind does that a lot. So you're walking down the sidewalk and people are zigging and zagging, and you're just like, God, I'm trying to get out of their way, and they keep stepping in my way, and they get out of my way, and they're walking down this side, and they're just staring at me, and they won't move, and how rude, rude, rude. And I do it anytime I go downtown. How do you note on that? How do you work with that? I mean, there's the recognition, but it's so automatic, it's so compulsory, you know, that seed is there.
I would say that, you know, first, this goes for the same situation as much as it does, you know, I'll just say what trying to connect two thoughts and it's not connecting. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that it's the same with meditation. Like a lot of people, they get kind of upset and they think, okay, now I'll just meditate and it'll be better. But if you didn't meditate before you're upset, you're not going to be able to meditate when you're upset. It's just like someone who has never learned anything about how to be a soldier, and now there's a war, I'm just going to jump into battle. You know, you're totally unprepared. You're just going to get smashed. You know, you have no chance. And so it's like, you have to do some contemplation, maybe some reading, some study, some thought, some meditation. Like, and I think primarily in these types of situations that you were describing, it's largely about a sense of thinking that other people should be more considerate to you, like assuming that they should care the way you care. And, you know, that is a tricky one because it's kind of coming from a place of an initial good thought, like, I want to be good. But then it switches automatically to, why aren't you trying to be good to me also? You know? So it's like a good thought that has then, like, you know, tricked itself or ruined itself by flipping on the other person. Because your initial intent is good. Like, I'm trying to be careful. I'm trying to give you space. Why aren't you giving me space? That kind of thing. And so, you know, in that situation, you know, I think that just the fundamental practices of meditation, of like calm abiding meditation that we talk about a lot at Namchak, and then the practices of loving kindness and compassion, wishing others to have happiness in the cause of happiness and be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. When you start to really develop that and have a little bit more of that developing in you, like on the cushion, like, or in your contemplation, in your reading, in your, let's just say your me time instead of your in the world time, then that starts to influence the way that you see people when you're out in the world. And so it is harder to just start to do that in life. But what I would say is that when you now are thinking about this and you're starting to take note of the fact that you do that, when, you know, the first step of all of these things is recognizing that you are doing that. Because for most of us, we don't even recognize that we do that. Or it's such a natural inclination that we're just like, we don't even recognize that there's something wrong with it, or that there's a fault in it, or that that's harmful, or that that's, you know, not productive, or whatever you want to say. So, you know, like I said before, like just the recognition itself is step number one. So you're already like working towards that in that. But yeah, I think that like the practices on the cushion prepare you to be able to work more in a way that's less just like you're not becoming disturbed out in the world, and you are more effective. Like, you know, Ken Rinpoche often talks about that the reason why, and this comes back similarly to the example of like the mother with the hands cut off and the child who's carried away in the river. Like right now, the reason why the example, the mother has her hands cut off is because we as a beginner practitioner, we don't have very much power to help others. We might be able to like help someone load a truck or like help them at the soup kitchen or whatever. But like in terms of like any bigger projects for trying to help others, they're probably going to be somewhat contaminated by our negative emotions and our pride and our ego and our judgment and our expectations. And so, you know, a big part of the practice is to try and develop in yourself, while setting your intention very firmly to benefit others, while your actions don't necessarily have to be so extensively trying to help others. Like, I think a lot of people, like, they get carried away, like, okay, I've talked about this bodhisattva stuff, so now I better start doing some huge project out in the world. But then you're not really ready for that. Or I'm not saying you personally, we're, as a beginner, like, they're not ready for that. And so, Ken Rinpoche often talks about that example that, like, when you're practicing the path, you're like you're not growing hands, but anyway, you're becoming enabled to help others in a way, so and it's similar, like you have to develop yourself so that when you're in the world, you're not only not disturbed, but you're more effectively able to render those relationships or those interactions in a wholesome way. Like, instead of you being like annoyed that they're in your way, you might pay them a nice compliment, tell them have a great day or whatever, like return that with kindness, so I don't know, there's a lot to it. Will the Walking the Path program cover additional Buddhist practices and supports Justin mentioned? Not exactly, but sort of. So in that program, there is a lot of additional reading that we have. And there are some other kinds of supports, like in Walking the Path, like we talk about refuge and bodhicitta, and talking about working with the principles of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and that as a support for the meditation, and the intention of bodhicitta as a support for the meditation. But not as much initially about the other kind of context, but maybe that's something that we can talk about, because we are doing more of these monthly teachings, and I've been doing more of them, and maybe I could do more of them that are focused in some of those other things about, we're doing that kind of right now about discipline and so forth. Like, discipline is one of those cornerstones, like supporting foundational practices of meditation, patience. That's kind of what we're doing right now to a certain extent. And the book that we give as recommended reading for the Walking the Path program is a long commentary to the Way of the Bodhisattva, which covers all of these topics. But we don't really have explicit teachings in the Walking the Path program about that book. We just recommend people read those chapters as they're doing the meditations. So yes and no. What suggestions do you or Justin have for the individuals that has a little difficulty retaining the teachings? Has there been students that have been learning disabilities? I know it's off subject. I'd say that what I could say, for one, is to read. For example, you might hear all this ton of information all at once. It's going to be really hard to retain much of any of it. But like we put the name of this book in that chat, and just, I highly encourage people to read a lot of Dharma books. If you're interested in really developing these practices, just read a lot of books about it. There's endless books about the Bodhisattva practices, the Way of the Bodhisattva. There's a bunch of commentaries on the Way of the Bodhisattva. There's this book, which is a similar book to the Way of the Bodhisattva, The Ornament of Precious Liberation. I recommend people read things. And if there's like a small list of principles that you're working with, just like, I find that, a lot of people, even if they find themselves maybe to have learning disabilities or whatever, they can still memorize song lyrics and things like that. And this is one thing that we don't emphasize in the Western adaptation of Tibetan Buddhism, but in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, in the monastic studies and so forth, we have to memorize a lot of material. Like, I had to take memorization tests every week in the monastery for 3 years. I'd like memorize certain amounts of text. Like, I'd have to memorize however many pages of text. And then on Friday morning, I'd have to like give my book to my teacher and say, okay, I memorized up to here, and then recite it to him back and have that memorized. So there's a certain amount of like, I still have retained like a ton of quotations from sutras and different texts of Nagarjuna and Shantideva and all this stuff. Ken Rinpoche has like enormous amounts of stuff, obviously, like, I'm learning as a second language and then memorizing in Tibetan when I was in the monastery. But I think that's something that hasn't been adopted in the Western adaptation. But I would say, like, you can make a small list of things that you're trying to adapt, maybe put it to a melody and try and memorize it, Like, I'm sure people memorized a poem when they were in high school or middle school or something like that. All kinds of, everyone memorizes song lyrics to their favorite songs. I think it's a good idea to try and memorize some things, like memorize the six perfections, or memorize the subdivisions of the perfections, whatever. You could make some lists for yourself, but definitely reading is the main thing. You don't have to retain everything. It's like read and then try and hold on to a few key points that you're trying to work with. And, I don't know. I think like even you could just have a small little notebook that you carry around with you just for the key principles that you're working on right now, and just try and refresh that. Like every time so you're sitting at a bus stop and you got 10 minutes to wait, you just like pull out your paper and look at it again, or have a note in your phone or whatever the case may be. But definitely reading again and giving yourself some kind of system of reminders for the tips and tricks or practices you're trying to implement, like some notes or a memorization or something like that. Yeah.
Justin, I'm noticing we're a little over time and some people are having to leave. So I just wanted to see if we could maybe close our session, and then are you willing, if people have questions, to stick around for a little bit longer?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just say a little, traditional Buddhist thing. We would have this thing we call dedication of merit. And basically what that means is, if you imagine that there's some great result, some goodness, some kind of like wholesome, positive energy or helpful situation that has come from us having this discussion. And basically the idea of this in Buddhism is that we shouldn't try and hold on to that for ourselves, but we should just kind of try to dedicate that, like kind of give that away with the wish that it could be a benefit to all beings, that it could bring all beings to the state of enlightenment. So I would encourage you just to give that a thought for a second. Just think, whatever benefit there was in this discussion that we had tonight, may it be a cause for the benefit of all living beings to attain enlightenment. All right. Did you have any closing stuff you need to say, Rachel?
Just thank you so much, Justin, for this really amazing Dharma talk and discussion tonight. And thank you for everyone who showed up, and for your participation and presence. And I put some information in the chat, but if you are not part of a learning circle and you would like to be, learning circles are, small groups that come together on usually a weekly basis to talk about the Dharma, practice together, and just support each other in community. So if you're not part of a learning circle and you'd like to be, please feel free to send me an email. Also, and Justin, you can probably round me out on this as well, but this is like our retreat month coming up in April. So we have almost every weekend in April, we have a retreat, and then we'll end our month of April with our next cohort for Walking the Path, which was the program that Justin was just talking about. So I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about.
I can fill that in. That was something I meant to talk about too, and I forgot just with all the time. I'm actually in New York City right now in an Airbnb because I'm, for the next 2 weekends in a row, April 7th through the 9th, and then whatever that next weekend is, the 14th or something like that. The first weekend, I'm teaching a 3-day kind of retreat on shamatha, calm abiding meditation. And it's going to be, teachings, but a lot of group practice. And then the next week, I'm doing a Friday, Saturday, Sunday on the Four Noble Truths. So that's kind of the basic foundational, like philosophical principles of Buddhism, kind of about what is suffering, what causes that, like what's our, mentally and physically, like what is that situation, what is liberation or Buddhahood, and then how do we get there? So it's kind of the whole format, like the whole structure of the Buddhist path contained in that teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So those are the next two. And then the third weekend is not open. That's for people who are already in the Walking the Path program, moving into the third and or fourth groups, or the first and second cohorts, but the third or fourth of the 4 weekends, or it's a 2-year program. And then the last weekend in April is a new group for Walking the Path. So that's open for anyone to join. And the Walking the Path program is a 2-year program that covers all the meditations of calm abiding and profound insight, shamatha and vipassana. And so basically what you would do is come for a weekend, get all the teachings for the first section. Then you get 6 months of meditation homework. So there's like a structure. You do this meditation for this many weeks, this meditation for that many weeks, and so forth. And every month you get an opportunity to check in about your meditation with myself or with Namchak Rinpoche. And so that is 6 months. And then the next, you come back and do another retreat, a weekend retreat, and you get the next level of calm abiding meditation and another 6 months. And then the second year you would come back again and do vipassana in the same kind of structure. But the part of this that's different than some of our other meditation retreats, like for example, the one that I'm doing next weekend here in New York, is that it's not Buddhist, but it's kind of more secularly structured, and walking the path is stably like centered in a Buddhist traditional path. So you recite a refuge prayer, you recite a bodhicitta prayer. You if you go on to the second year into the Vipassana program, you're not allowed to join the Vipassana program unless you want to actually take refuge vows and become a Buddhist. Like it's the ceremony of becoming a Buddhist formally. So like those teachings, like the Vipassana teachings, which is meditations on emptiness, are you're only able to enter into that as someone who wants to like become a Buddhist formally. So that's why it's called walking the path. It's like walking the traditional path of Buddhism. So that's kind of the dividing line in the Namchak programming between kind of secular mindfulness kind of based things and traditional Buddhism, is that program is one of those points. Ancient Wisdom Engaged is another one of those points. So the awe program is kind of moving towards that traditional Buddhist path as well. So anyway, that's what's going on. You can find all that info on the events page of the Namchak website, and we can keep doing some questions. I can hang out till whenever if you want to. I'm just, although it is 9:43 p.m. in New York.
So for the retreats for the Walking the Path year-long program, the first year, they're online available for both of those?
Yeah, but
Okay.
for the second year, you would have to come in person for at least the first of the two.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great class tonight. Thank you. I'm going to get out of here and let you guys rest.
Okay. Thanks, Amy.
Bye-bye.
Anything else?
I have a question. Let me see if I can articulate it. It was about dependent origination or dependent arising, and I've never heard that linked with emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and so that's really interesting. Like I kind of heard you say that, like, because everything is connected, it's like nothing can happen without it being connected or without everything happening. So that's related to emptiness. So I'm just wondering if you could kind
That's
of more
actually like
in depth with that, because
yeah, sure.
I never heard it related.
Yeah, that's there are 4 or 5 what are called the 4 or 5 great reasons of the middle way, which is like called the Madhyamaka philosophy of, anyway, it's the philosophy of emptiness. And the 5th, which is called the supreme reason why everything is empty, is because everything is interdependent, or because it's dependent arising. So what that means, let me just break this down for you real quick. Once it clicks, it's like so obvious, but it sounds weird. So if first, I think the easiest thing to understand is what's the opposite of emptiness. The opposite of emptiness is truly, singularly, independently existing. So what's truly, singularly, and independently exists? Nothing. But that's how our mind thinks everything exists. And that's how our mind interacts with the objects of our mind. And that's why we suffer. According to Buddhism, we suffer because we think everything is truly existing as it appears to our mind. When in reality, everything only exists in relation to other things. So nothing independently exists. Nothing exists in a vacuum in and of itself. But the reason we suffer is because our minds interact with things as if they truly existed.
So then nothing's like a separation from the reality of everything being connected?
Well, I think that I think everything being connected is a little bit of an overstatement. You can say that, and they say that in some Zen traditions and stuff, you know, the butterfly effect, that kind of thing. But that's not exactly what it means. It's more just that, like, for example,
everything is in relationship. Like connected is almost a weird word because it's like already connected. Like you can't, like using the word connection already is assuming that it's not connected in a way, kind of.
I see what you're saying there, and that's true. But I think one problematic word that we've been using is connected with everything. And what I want to say is that that's not exactly the point. The point is just that things don't exist in and of themselves. They exist in reliance upon other things.
Okay.
Like if an example that they give in some of the Buddhist texts is like two sticks that are leaning up against each other, and they can only stand up if the other one is there. And everything is like that, meaning that nothing exists on its own. And so I know that that sounds quite obvious, and this is something I mentioned early on in the talk tonight, is that the teachings of interdependence seem very obvious to the Western mind, who have been, not just Western, I mean, most modern developed countries, they learn math, science, all this kind of thing. So we already think in this kind of critical way. We already understand processes and, social conditioning and all these kind of things, that everything is a process. But that's not the way our minds react in an emotional reaction, or even just in our ordinary way that we see things. Like, and I know that that's something that I'm telling you that as if you should understand that, but I don't think most people understand that. This is like a Buddhist principle. Like, according to Buddhism, I should say, our minds relate to their objects in a way as if they are truly existing and independently existing. And so, but they're not. And that's why we suffer, is because we apply this assumption of their true and independent existence and judge and evaluate them on that basis. We don't see their interdependent nature. And
so like our desires create the world around us, kind of like our attachment to stuff.
That's also true. Yes. Yeah. And that is to the point, but it's kind of like our attachment. We wouldn't be attached to things if we didn't believe they were truly existing.
Sure. So, but then like when you get enlightened, like if anybody is, do they just like cease to exist?
No, they just cease to be attached to anything. So there's a famous quote from this teacher named Tilopa teaching his student Naropa. He says, "My son Naropa, appearances don't bind you, your grasping binds you, so cut through your grasping." He didn't say cut through appearances, or destroy existence, or like stop seeing things or stop experiencing the world. He said stop being fixated on things, stop grasping or being attached to things. And the way you stop grasping or being attached to things is by seeing their reality, by seeing their interdependent nature.
So if everybody like became enlightened, like the world wouldn't exist, right?
That is a very strange metaphysical question, which is very tricky.
Okay.
I think that for the basis of our discussion, we should just assume that there is an external reality that is somehow, exists in a relativistic way, in an interdependent way, and that the external reality isn't entirely dependent on our minds. So, like, for example, there can be a table sitting there, and there is some like physical, tangible thing there, but it's my grasping intellectually or mentally to the idea of what it is that causes my relationship to it to be skewed. It's not the physical existence of there being a piece of wood there that's causing me to have an issue, or like causing me to have some mental imbalance. It's my belief or something that my mind is creating about the table that's creating the problem.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I was just trying to piece it all together. I don't know.
Or like situationally, maybe it's harder to
understand.
understand with a table. Like, let's think of a person.
Yeah.
Like, let's say I'm upset with Rachel, or Rachel did something disturbing to me, and it's because I believe Rachel truly exists as this thing. Like, you're a mean person. You're a critical person. Like, I'm holding these assumptions about her that I believe to be real, and that she is a real, truly existing person that exists in this way, like as a mean or critical or harsh or whatever kind of person. When in reality, she might just be upset that day, and like something else caused her to be upset. Someone really like did something really harmful to her right before we were talking, which triggered her to feel that way. And I'm not seeing any of that process. I'm just fixating on you being real and true, and then having an emotional reaction to that. So it's like, it's not anything to do with Rachel or whether she exists or not. It is how I am interacting with Rachel, like what my mind is creating about Rachel.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So like, for example, if things were not interdependent, so there's a famous quote from Nagarjuna where he says, whatever is born is unborn. So unborn is like a word in Buddhism, which means like, maybe that was a bad example because it requires too much philosophical discussion. It's a synonym for emptiness. But basically what it's saying is that like, if something was created by causes and conditions, that is proof that it's not truly existing. Because it has a cause, it was dependent on something else. So true existence would mean independent, not relying upon other things for its existence. Separate, independent, fixed, not functional, basically. Like if things truly existed, they couldn't do anything.
Sure. So like I exist as Reed because that's what you guys know me as, but like if I didn't identify with like the things that made me me, am I just
So I'll give you
not here?
a brief summary of like the idea of selflessness. This might help. So
Okay.
basically in Buddhism, the way that they talk about what you think is Reed is it's an idea in your head based on your body, your physical body, your feelings, your thoughts, your perceptions, like thinking this is this and that's that, and some other kind of mental factors. And all of that stuff is jumbled together and thought of as one little thing. And you think that's Reed, that's me.
Yeah.
But where is the me separate from those processes? Where's the me separate from your body and your thought process and your feelings? There's no such thing. Where's the Reed that possesses all of those things?
Yeah, that's true.
It doesn't
Constantly changing.
Yeah. So like that Reed itself doesn't exist. Your thoughts are changing, your body's changing, your feelings are changing. And similarly, if you go deeper, you examine your body itself, you find that there is no body. There's just parts. Where is the body that possesses your arms and your legs and your eyes and your ears? There is only the eyes of your body, the eyes of, or the arms of your body. But if you get rid of all those parts, where's the actual body? There is no body.
Okay.
The body is just an idea based on these parts. And you can keep doing that to infinity, like down to like the subatomic particles of your body. You never find anything that truly exists. That's the principle of emptiness in Buddhism. So
it's kind of hard to wrap my head around. I don't know.
No, I mean, it absolutely is. And it's like, that's why it's, it's not something that, it's something that for me, like in a monastery, we studied just the topic of emptiness for 2 full years. And that's like everyday class, 3 hours a day of debating, all this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying everyone has to do that, but it's like something I've been studying for like 20 years to be able to talk about it with confidence like this. It's not something that, that in like a 5-minute discussion, anyone would expect you to fully grasp, but it like, that's kind of the idea, is just that like the self is the easiest starting point, because you can pretty clearly see that like Reed as an entity is just an idea based on your body and feelings and thoughts, basically.
Yeah.
And so
emotions.
Yeah. And once you take that, you can apply that same kind of logic to basically anything in the world. So, but it, it takes some time, and it's like intellectually understanding it isn't going to fully change your whole perspective on the world. It's something you have to like think about and contemplate, gain a certainty of, meditate on, it's like one of the main things that they talk about in Buddhism is that like everything, and in karma is everything is a process of habituation. And up to now, from if you only believe in this life, just this life, or maybe from countless past lives, you've been believing that you're real, that there is a real Reed, there's a real me, whatever. And so just hearing that's just an idea once is not going to uproot that whole habit of your whole 25 years or 30 years, however old you are, of life, So that's why, meditation on emptiness or on the selflessness is kind of undoing the habits of believing in the self, but it takes time. Yeah.
It does. Yeah. No, I've kind of been playing around with Buddhism for like a couple of years, but I've bought this book by Paramita.
Oh yeah,
kind of reading that.
She's great.
And I don't know. I just think it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad to have you. It's awesome. Great to talk to you. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's call tonight.
Cool. See you guys later.
Good night. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. We'll see you soon.